Welcome, everybody. I know some of you, but not all of you, which is fun. Welcome to the first event of our new series, Reading Modern Art. We're celebrating new publications on art and visual cultures from the last third of the 19th century through to the 1960s. We're also celebrating winners of our publication grants. Hands up if you don't know about our publication grants. There we are, at least a couple of people don't. So for those people, we have a competition biennially for new books in the field, and we award up to $12,000 to support these books. They're supporting authors who, the costs of publishing books in the field of modern art is very high, particularly for reproduction costs, indexing and so on, and the market for these kinds of books is very tough. So I think we've supported 22 so far, and we've got another round we're about to assess. So, it's an important scheme. Now, reading modern art. Each evening, and this is the first of this badge set of evenings, will include an introduction by the author of the book that we're looking at this evening, and a discussion with an expert respondent or respondents. We had hoped to have Stephanie D'Alessandro with us, but she's got a family issue, means she couldn't be with us this time, but we have a marvellous respondent who stands for many. There'll be time also for audience contributions, so get your questions at the ready for after the panel discussion. Anyway, I'm so delighted and honoured to introduce tonight's author, Christopher Green, Professor Emeritus at the Courtauld Institute of Art, London, who will introduce his new book, Cubism and Reality, Braque, Picasso, Gris, published a few months ago, I think, by Bloomsbury. Have I got that right? September, there we go. Is that a few months ago? Time flies, right? Anyway, as many of you will know, Christopher Green is one of the most prolific, world-renowned. You can say that sometimes in introductions, but I actually mean it in this case. World-renowned expert in the field of modern art, particularly European modern art. Books he's published include Leger and the Avant-Garde of 1976, Cubism and Its Enemies of 1987, Art in France, 1900 and 1940, published in 2000, and Picasso, Architecture and Vertigo of 2005. These are all very substantial books, some of which I struggled with during my PhD. I'll get back to that later. Alongside these superb contributions, he's a prolific curator of exhibitions. As I pointed out to him earlier, that also means publishing books, in fact. These exhibitions include a milestone Juan Gris show at the Whitechapel in London. Really remember that. Modern Antiquity, Picasso, de Chirico, Leger, Picabia at the Getty Museum in LA. Cubism and War, The Crystal in the Flame at the Museo Picasso, Barcelona. He organised a wonderful Henri Rousseau show at Tate Modern in 2005 called Jungles in Paris, and has just come hotfoot this evening from the opening of a new Rousseau show at the Barnes Foundation. The Painter's Secret. True? Rousseau, The Painter's Secret. Go and see it. Now, Chris terrified me when he examined my PhD in 1991, before many of you were born. And we've since then become firm friends, nevertheless. It was wonderful to work with him again as a member of the Research Center's Advisory Committee before his term ended this year. Sadness. Tonight's respondent is Harry Cooper, Bunny Mellon Curator of Modern Art at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and a current member of the Research Center's Advisory Committee. He's organised and co-organised exhibitions on Mondrian, Medard Rosso, Frank Stella, Stuart Davis, Oliver Jackson, and black self-taught artists of the American South, and has taught at Harvard, Columbia University, and Johns Hopkins. His retrospective of Philip Guston, which was amazing, concluded its tour at Tate Modern in 2023-4. His publications include Decoding Gris in Cubism and Colour of 2021 at Dallas Museum of Art, the Cubism Seminars, Casava Seminar Papers 3, National Gallery of Art 2017, which he edited, and Braque's Ovals in Picasso and Braque, The Cubist Experiment, at Santa Barbara Art Museum 2011. So, the next Reading Modern Art event will focus on Jennifer Weissenfeld's recent book, The Fine Art of Persuasion, Corporate Advertising, Design, Nation and Empire in Modern Japan. That will be on November the 13th, so put that in your diaries, November the 13th, 2025, 6 till 7:30, because on that occasion we will be able to have a reception afterwards. So there'll be a free glass and a nibble for those of you who make it. The respondents will be John Carpenter from the Met, from Asian Art in the Met, and Georgia Traganu. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you Christopher Green. Please welcome him.
Well, now and again I'm going to have to crouch down to get my water because there isn't a table. But that's just too bad. Oh, that's a very good idea.
Is there a coaster?
That's a little still life. The trouble with doing this, because when you've written a book, is that everything that I'm going to say about it will be a reduction or a dilution. So I do hope that those of you who are interested will actually read it, at least parts of it. Anyway, I want to begin by, hang on a second, remembering two events which took place when I was a fellow at the Lauder Center in 2018. One took place in front of this picture, Juan Gris's Man at the Cafe of 1914. It was out of its frame, on an easel, in the painting conservation studio here in the Met. I was there with Emily Braun, and we were discovering what an investigation into the material history of the picture had revealed. Isabelle Duvernois, painting conservator, was there, and because the picture includes cut newspaper, so was the paper conservator, Rachel Mustalish. We'd been invited by them to hear their findings. The excitement, the fascination, the sheer pleasure of being part of that session gave an unforgettable intensity to the experience. And it taught me things that I couldn't have learned any other way. The second event, also that year, took place in the seminar room at the centre. I tried out my argument for the final chapter of my book on my fellow fellows, Rachel Boat, Maria Castro, Louise Mahler, and Sian O'Hanlon. Stephanie D'Alessandro, the head of the centre, was there too, and so was Lauren Rosati, who just arrived as a curator attached to the centre. That afternoon, I was helped to see clearly how I could argue my response to Rosalind Krause's formidable essay on this confrontation between Francis Picabier's proto-Dada machine portraits and Picasso's classic realist drawings. And you see on the right his portrait of Eric Satie of 1920, which is the final illustration in my book. Many collaborations with people and institutions led to the book, but one above all, with the people who make up the community in and around the Lauder. I thank everyone who helped me in the months that I was here turn what was really a vague idea at that time for a book into the drafts that actually became a book, and all those who kept me going through the years that followed to actually finish writing it. There's another person I need to thank, who died before the book started stewing in my mind, and that was John Golding, my teacher, who was the one who got me looking and thinking about Cubist artworks when I heard his lectures, which was in the mid to late 1960s, a very long time ago. When I was a student at that time, his history and analysis was the only trusted and challenging way into Cubist artworks, at least that I knew at that time. There are key moments in my book when I'm in conversation, in a sense, with John, although I don't necessarily say so. And in the first chapter, he actually comes in as a figure in the book, as a painter, as well as a historian of Cubism, a high modernist painter who admired especially the work of Georges Braque. You see a John Golding of the mid-1980s, upper right. You see Braque's Studio 2, upper left. And I'll come to what you see down below in a moment. In that chapter, I look at Golding as a painter-historian and admirer above all of Braque's late studio series. And I look at those alongside the paintings that Roy Lichtenstein called his idiot Picassos. And I juxtapose them with Picasso's late The Painter and His Model series. I use Golding and Lichtenstein with Braque in the 1940s and 50s and Picasso in 1963-64 to bring Braque's and Picasso's Cubism before 1914-18 a bit closer to our century. You'll have to read the book to see why and how I do that job. Golding is there as a painter responding to paintings. Lichtenstein is there as a painter responding to reproductions of paintings. My book is about a conversation carried on between artists through their artworks. I call it a radical trialogue, with the three in conversation: Braque, Picasso, and Juan Gris. Juan Gris on this side, 1912, Picasso in the middle, 1909-10, and Braque on the left, 1909-10. But Picasso's celebrity, along with his prolixity and the suddenness of his switches of direction, mean that to keep up with him, I've had to illustrate more Picassos than all the Braques and the Grises put together. So to counteract what is in fact a sort of challenge to my trialogic project, my focus in every chapter has been on the interactive relation between them. Braque, in fact, offered more as a technician, and Juan Gris, I argue, used his work to deliver what amounts to a critique, especially of his mentor Picasso's Cubism. Then there's the problem of that word, Cubism. It's a word that removes discussion of the work of these three artists before 1914-18 into the dehumanized ideal space of elementary geometry, which the work itself, my book argues, resists. Cubism could just as well have ended up being called Surrealism, given that Guillaume Apollinaire invented the term Surrealism with what was called Cubism very much in his mind. And an argument central to my book is that making more of reality, whatever that was or could be, was what the work of Braque, Picasso, and Gris was about in the long half-decade before August 1914. Everyone now, almost whatever language they speak, has surreal experiences. No one anywhere has cubic experiences. It's simply assumed that being supremely intellectual, Cubism, especially pre-collage Cubism, has little to do with reality experienced in any everyday sense, our individual daily contact with the world, seeing, touching, hearing, remembering, reflecting. My argument is that even the least legible Braques and Picassos of 1910 to 12, these 10 to 12 on the, or 11 to 12 on the left, and really more like 10, 9, 10 on the right, Braque. My argument is that even the least legible Braques and Picassos of 10 to 12 respond to their lived experience in the world. The book's title is Cubism and Reality. I chose the title because of a statement made by Picasso and picked up by Yves Alain Bois, and I quote, "Cubism," Picasso is said to have said, "Cubism was fundamentally a base kind of materialism." I treat the works made by Braque, Picasso and Gris before 1914-18 fundamentally as material objects put together by three individuals. That's why invitations from conservators to look at works with them have been so important to me. But these artists did not, I argue, themselves take reality as objectively always there, but as a product of perception, as produced by perception. So the reality represented in their artworks is different and changing in every case, as settings change and time moves, and we, in the act of looking, touching, or imagining touching, make the work different too. Since Rosalind Krauss published her essay In the Name of Picasso in the magazine October in 1981, the paintings and collages of Braque, Picasso and Gris have much more been read than visually analysed. I don't contend that visual art can somehow communicate without language. It cannot. Neither do I contend that their work, even pictures like these, somehow bypass language's structuring of communication and communicate solely by way of some primordial perceptual capacity that we all have. But what matters most to me in the book is not reading works of art, but looking at each work and engaging the sense of touch. When I bring in theory, especially in my chapters on the early Cubism of all three, and on those sometimes impenetrable paintings by Braque and Picasso of 1910 to 12. When I do this, I use the extraordinary critical writing of Carl Einstein and phenomenology as it came out of the thinking of Husserl and Heidegger into the thinking especially of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and to a less extent Jean-Paul Sartre. They've helped me to open up what for me have been new ways of looking again at the works that John Golding introduced me to 50 years ago. A picture like Picasso's Accordionist gives us a great deal to see. Those planes tilting in and out of the surface, and invites us to touch it all over. As one of my fellow fellows in 2018, Louise Mahler, established, when it was first exhibited in Lyon in 1912, the title was actually Joueuse d'un accordéon. The accordionist was given a gender. She's a she. The paradox is that just what she looked like, the picture decisively, deliberately, it's made clear, fails to tell us. Those planes obscure. They do not reveal. Without any comment at all, I juxtapose here the picture with a key passage from Merleau-Ponty's The Phenomenology of Perception, and I quote, "The first philosophical act would appear to be to return to the world of actual experience, which is prior to the objective world. Our task will be to rediscover phenomena, the layer of living experience through which other people and things are first given to us. The system self, other, things, as it comes into being. To reawaken perception and foil its trick of allowing us to forget it as fact and as perception in the interest of the object which it presents and of the rational tradition to which it, the object, gives rise. Pictures like this, and like Braque's Woman Reading of 1911, have titles that name things, but they refuse to picture for us an objective world. At once, they arouse the perceptual faculties and stimulate reflection on what we are or are not seeing, so that we look and look with no more than moments of recognition. My chapter on these paintings is above all about how and why Braque and Picasso allowed themselves to fail time after time. There's a single word that can seem to sum it up, the French word l'infinition. Much later, in one of his cahiers, Braque noted that he was working towards l'infinition. The word sets aside the possibility of arriving at definitions. It translates as a process of defining which can never reach a definition. Through the central 3 chapters of the book, which deal with Braque's, Picasso's and Gris's Cubist work before 1914-18, Juan Gris, who is too often said to be the obedient follower, is actually the difficult one. The one whose work asks why this new way of working should necessarily demand that he fail as a communicator, speaking about the world of things, places, and people. It was he who, according to Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, the dealer of all 3 of them, came up with the term analytical cubism for early Cubism, with all of its cut and dried conclusiveness. I'm not going to go into Gris's response to Braque's and Picasso's early Cubism. There's no time for that. It'll have to be enough to say that his still life with flowers on the right, which was shown at the Salon des Indépendants in 1912, is both a homage and a critique of Braque's series of musical still lives, which were done just a couple of years before, and the way that he juxtaposes the musical instrument with the cruche, the water jug, it has to be some sort of a response, I think, on the part of Gris. But it's a critique, I think, too. I'm going to end this evening with the coming of collage. It was with collage that Juan Gris really comes into his own alongside Braque and Picasso. To keep brief what I have to say about their trialogue as collagists, I'm going to focus on 2 themes which are developed in the book. First, making, the lived activity of making the work. It's a key theme, I argue, for situating both pre- and post-Cubism, for post-collage Cubism, that is, in the bigger histories of modernism. Second, the conflict between the acceptance of loss, of the work itself as ephemeral, and the inspiration to make work that lasts, that defeats death. Christine Poggi uses the word labour for the making of Picasso's constructions. There's a Braque, incidentally, on the left in 1913, and Picasso on the right, late 1912. Certainly, for all 3, making the post-collage pieces was work. But it was fun too, serious fun. It made mischief as well as exercising the mind. André Billy, who was a kind of assistant editor with Apollinaire on the periodical Les Soirées de Paris, he wrote a little piece in 1913, which he called, how did he call it? Becoming a Poet or something like that. I can't remember the title exactly. Anyway, in this little piece, he has Apollinaire as the charming Hector. And Hector and he, André Billy, are on a train coming into Paris. And they start talking about how mail order catalogues and posters could be poetry. And B looks at an alarm on the side of the train, which you could pull the cord of. And he says, well, look, the warning there that says you're going to be in real trouble if you pull that, that's poetry. And Napoleon says, yes, it gives you a kind of vertigo. It's poetry. And then they start shouting, because they go past a station and they see the name of the station. They start shouting, Goussainville, 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 after which they burst into laughter. And then, the way that B tells it, there's a long silence. And it kind of says that the laughter, the mischief, and then the silence, the reflection, the two things go together. It's a kind of provocation and at the same time something that makes you reflect. I think it says very well, somehow, the spirit behind these things. In the book, I avoid the terms image or product for the things these artists made then. Artworks and works are the terms that I prefer. These artworks seldom offer quickly consumed images. They're most often penetrated by looking, imagining, reflecting, and looking again. There's nothing, or there's rarely anything very definitive. And especially directly in the post-collage work, looking again and again reveals how they were made in ways that invite a reimagining of what it was like actually to make them. Writing about collage over the last couple of decades, before that is the emergence of the French art historian Claire Le Thomas, has focused especially on the reuse of such mechanically manufactured products as oilcloth, wallpaper, and so on, as if the incorporation of such products aligns Cubist collage and papier-collés with the anonymity of machine production. The term I prefer, rather than the term papier-collés, is drawings with papers. I take it, that term, from the phrasing of Kahnweiler's contract with Braque. I quote, dessin avec papier bois, marbre, et tout autre accessoire. It's a term, drawings with papers, which puts the emphasis not on the work as a fact, a product, but on making as an activity as provisional, as ongoing, as open-ended as drawing can be. Every Cubism aficionado knows that Picasso's constructions came straight out of what I call his drawings with papers. And so did this, the astonishing installation that only survives in 5 glass negatives, recording 5 snaps that Picasso took during the brief time it existed in his Boulevard Raspail studio in the summer of 1913. A section of the chapter on the coming of collage follows phase by phase the making, recording, and destruction of this Cubist place, with its part drawn, part constructed guitarist playing a real guitar, and its real cafe table still life. I follow Picasso as he moves from drawings with papers into drawing combined with the cutting and gluing of paperboard to photographing using masking and overdrawing to alter as well as to record for some unknown future. I made the decision to use as my image of the installation this. It's a modern print from a glass negative which has been partially destroyed by time. Initially, I made that decision because using one of the much more informative prints that survive, like the one that I just showed you, became near impossible, especially because of the unaffordable copyright fees being asked for by the people who owned those prints, or the glass negatives. But in the end, I'm actually pleased that I was forced to use the image because in the book it acts as a reminder of the sheer precarity of the entire installation project from the start to the finish. It fixes attention on making as an activity with no permanent outcome, involving photography too. And at the same time, transience emerges as within the whole process, including the installation's afterlife as an image. It's not a term, though, drawings with papers, that fits Juan Gris as a collagist. His pictures with cut paper, and I bring back in the middle here, Man at the Cafe, have the finished look of his painted works. As became very clear, detail by detail, in that session looking at this picture out of its frame here, Gris does a very great deal to conceal process. He makes this and most of his pictures with cut papers solid and very complete in the whole way they appear. They're, you could say, museum ready, even if no museum at the time would have accepted them. From the lived activity of making the drawings with paper came in the work of Braque and Picasso objects that would have been, for most who saw them in 1912 to 14, almost literally rubbish. Of course, we know that well. On seeing photographs of Picasso's first constructions in a London gallery in 1914, the British artist Wyndham Lewis remarked, and I quote, "You feel the glue will come unstuck." The photograph you see on screen is of another assemblage put together at the time of the studio installation. It reuses fastened to a wallpapered wall the violin construction which appears to one side in the installation, you might remember. It's like some bizarre, do-it-yourself room decoration. Yet, the conflict between the patent ephemerality of such an assemblage and painting as an art, you could say, for the museums, is not revealed by confronting Braque and Picasso with Gris's cut paper works alone. It's actually there to be seen in Braque's and Picasso's practice too. Making their drawings with papers and Picasso's constructions and assemblages did not stop them from painting. Indeed, the drawings with papers, and Picasso's sorties into 3 dimensions as well, directly interacted with the paintings that they continued to make. You see here, alongside one of Braque's late 1912 drawings with papers, a Braque that is a 1913 sequel to it. It's actually one of a group of papier-collés, the one on the left, or drawings with papers, the one on the left, and it's a sequel to that whole group, really, this work. In reproduction, this work is easily taken to be another drawing with papers, but much of it is actually painted. The papier-bois is combed paint, and the music sheet carefully fakes the precision printing of such a sheet in paint, and even fakes the yellowing with age of the paper. He's left a few drawn charcoal hatchings here, but most of all, this is a painting. It's a work made to last. Collage and drawings with paper released in new directions the poetic imagination, but also brought a different range of skills into painting. It wasn't just about de-skilling. My last slide is a Juan Gris. It's the cover image of the book. It quotes what, of course, is famous as the first Cubist collage, Picasso's still life with chair caning. But the chair caning is meticulously painted, and there's absolutely no stuck down paper on this picture. It is a painting. It's a painting, museum ready in its high finish, but the experience it offers is not stable. It provokes viewers not to take anything in it on trust, either what it seems to be as a material thing, or the material three-dimensional factuality of the things it represents. L'infinition may not be the right term for this picture, but there is always something else to see, even in so workmanlike a work as this. The argument that ultimately holds my book together is that the direction of travel that took these three artists into and through their Cubist discoveries in 1908 to 1914 was towards a future for figurative painting. Even Picasso's constructions, as Cubist sculptures, never lose touch with painting and drawing. Painting and drawing as a lived activity responding to people, places, and things, but an activity that responds also to the fragmentary, mobile ways of looking that are generated by the distracted experiences offered by urban modernity. When I was in search for a publisher for my book, one commissioning editor said to me, a little dismissively, Cubism before 1914-18, it's now a marginal specialist subject in a hugely expanded and diversified visual art and cultural historical field. And she's right. In the 1960s, when the mysteries of these works first seduced me, to study Cubism was to study something that was centrally important to anyone engaged in contemporary art. In 2000, Cubism became an art movement of the last century. Finally, and unequivocally, it was history. I want to end with a quote from Ortega y Gasset. I can't remember actually where I stole it from, but here it is. All we have is our history, and it does not belong to us. Thank you.
Okay. Not Cubism. I'm so glad to be here, so glad to be part of the Lauder Center. Glad that Neil asked me to do this, and partly because it made me read this book, which I probably wouldn't have gotten to otherwise for a little while. And it's really extraordinary. Congrats to Gris. Now I'll proceed to take a shot at it. Okay. Sorry for my American accent. Really doesn't sound good after Chris and Neil. Can't help it. Nor am I the expert really on Cubism that they are, or that Professor Carmel is, or others in the audience. But I've had a couple of shots at it, and I will now take another one. And I'm going to read this, and it will be just about 4 pages, so hopefully we'll get through it quickly and have time for some discussion. Chris's book, I'm going to use your first name, has the clarity that comes of a career-long engagement with his trio of artists, as well as many other figures, as we heard, Leger, Mondrian, French art in general of the early 20th century. He is clear about what he will not do. He will not reach back as far as Picasso's 1907 painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, even though it may be the first, at least partly, Cubist painting. Nor will he broach the issues of primitivism, desire, fear, and so on that it raises. He does talk about mortality, though, quite a bit, which it also raises. And he will not widen his lens to include any of the other Cubists. He will focus on the interactions of the 3 core Cubists in the 6 core years, 1908 to 1914, and even then, he will not try to cover all of the paintings or all of the series. Furthermore, his method will be about looking and experiencing, not reading and decoding. which means, he writes, that his approach will be informed by phenomenology, not semiology. I'm not sure that these methods are quite so opposed, and indeed, you have softened that dichotomy yourself just now. Still, I appreciate this impulse to do less rather than more when it comes to the eye-bending complexity of Cubism. As a friend of mine mutters to himself when he is at the stove making a pasta sauce, focus, focus, focus. Makes a good pasta sauce. Gris is also admirably clear about his argument, which is that the trio worked, each in their own way, whether deliberately or not, at different times, toward the preservation of figurative painting in an age when photography, movies, and other new developments were calling the purposes of painting into question and distracting the attention of its potential viewers. Gris suggests that rather than simply lamenting or opposing such distraction, Cubism worked with it, and in making paintings that remain more open to interpretation than painting had arguably ever been, Cubism placed viewers above painters. It was, he writes, and I think perhaps a moment of relevance to today, anti-authoritarian. I don't know when you wrote that, if you wrote that in the last few weeks or last few months. The most exciting thing about the book for me is that it circles around a question, really an enigma, that has long bothered me and others and seems central to the history of modernism. How did the Impressionists' intense focus on their perceptions and sensations in nature in front of the motif lead rather quickly to the near elimination of the motif, to the brink of abstraction? It's a question posed acutely by such late Cézanne paintings as Jardin at Les Louvres, The Garden at Les Louvres. It's Philip's collection. I grew up with this painting, love this painting. This is made shortly before his death in 1906. Cézanne had set up a studio north of Aix-en-Provence. He wanted this for its views out across the Provençal landscape to Mont-Saint-Victoire, rendered here as a peachy proto-Braque absence. See it there? It's peachy. And Cézanne wrote, "I would occupy myself for months, leaning once a little more to the right, once a little more to the left," unquote. This foreshadows the viewpoint mobility and perhaps the aspect simultaneity, a term Gris borrows from Leo Steinberg, that have long been ascribed to Cubist paintings. We can detect a juicy lawn in the foreground, maybe a slate wall, a distant plain, a horizon, perhaps the framing of tree limbs tangled with clouds across the top, but it all seems to vibrate and dissolve and reform a symphonic patchwork of color and primed bare canvas, organizing itself before his eyes and before our eyes. Such is the Cézanne who stands at the origin of Cubism, a point of origin so well known that Gris doesn't even bother to remind the reader that it was Cézanne's death in 1906 and 2 Paris retrospectives the following year that helped plunge Braque and Picasso into their Cézannism. In his second chapter, Gris closely traces this Cézannian turn in the landscapes that Braque painted in the summer of 1909 at La Roche-Guyon and in the female nudes Picasso painted in Paris the same year. Chapter 3 then turns to the so-called Hermetic Cubism of 1910-1912, when gridded facet planes and neo-pointillist touches swamp the surface of the pictures, and it becomes impossible to identify what is being depicted, despite descriptive titles supplied by their dealer, Kahnweiler. And thence to chapter 4 in 1912 to 1914, in which the invention of papier-collé brings a restoration of legibility, not because the collaged elements somehow carried brute reality back into the picture, not Gris's argument. After all, the newspapers, wallpapers, sheet music, colored papers, and painted imitations of those were used far more wittily in an endless play of fooling and unfooling the eye. No, they brought in legibility simply because the cut and shaped pieces of paper allowed silhouettes of objects or part objects to enter the image space. To jump outside the book for a moment and talk about an artist I'm more comfortable with even, Mondrian went through his own Cézannism. There's the ginger pot at the Guggenheim, 1911-1912 on the left, and his own analytic cubism, composition in gray-blue at the Thyssen in Madrid, 1912-13, before he arrived at a complete break with perceptual painting, 1920 at the Stedelijk, arguably his first kind of classic neoplastic painting. What Mondrian said about this is very interesting for us tonight, I think. Cubism did not accept the logical consequences of its own discoveries, he wrote. Bad Cubism. In other words, the inherent vector of Cubism was towards abstraction, and it was only a failure of nerve that kept it from taking the plunge in 1912. If this sounds a lot like Clement Greenberg in its insistence on a teleological march toward flatness and abstraction, that is no surprise. Greenberg knew his Mondrian. But what was it in this purported internal logic of modernism that led to abstraction? Was it, to return to our enigma, that having to put those sensations, think of the Cézanne, for example, to put those sensations down in paint meant honoring the demands of what Maurice Denis in 1890 called a flat surface covered with colors assembled in a certain order? Or was it that the painter's focus on his or her sensations was so intense, as some phenomenologists have proposed, that what was perceived became secondary to or even lost in the act of perceiving? I think Chris's answer is, in effect, and you can correct me on this in a few minutes, I think your answer is neither. For he rejects the premise of this narrative. For him, the project of Cubism is one of figurative preservation, a project in which the demands of the medium and the demands of perception might sometimes work together, more often in the case of Braque, or sometimes in tension with Picasso. But in any case, they worked to maintain some purchase on space and experience. Thus, the flattening out of three-dimensional forms in Cubism is not just a matter of representing some notional essence of painting as flat and rectangular, but it's also a matter of allowing a fuller grasp of the object by squashing it and spreading it out so that, in effect, we can look at more sides of it at the same time, something that would be impossible under normal laws of perspective. As Chris writes of the 1908 to 10 period, Braque does not feel much conflict between, quote, giving himself license to move in front of the motif and maintaining constructive fidelity to the picture surface, unquote. Whereas for Picasso, quote, it is a conflict he is not even sure whether to resolve, unquote. The difference between Braque and Picasso in this score reflects the essential personalities or personae that Chris assigns them. And I hope I'm doing some good work here in covering some aspects of the book that you didn't have time to do. Braque is the peintre décorateur, in love with the tactility of real and faux surfaces and the tools that can render them. And after all, his father was a professional decorator and taught him many things. Picasso, on the other hand, is the painter-sculptor, eager for full possession of objects and bodies in the round. Which brings us finally to Gris, and one of the essential roles that Chris assigns him, a role that he did not have time to share with us, so I will, at least with regard to one moment. That moment begins in November 1911, when Picasso, following several months, intense months with Braque in Céret in the southwest of France, returns to a studio in the Bateau Lavoir in Montmartre, that ramshackle building where poor Gris had to live for many, many years because he couldn't afford to get out. And so the two, Picasso and Gris, renew a close, intense dialogue. Gris able to observe firsthand the extremes of Hermetic Cubism. Think of the accordionist, for example. So Chris suggests that, and I think I can skip ahead here. There we go. He suggests that in a work like Man in a Cafe in the middle there, 1912 Philadelphia Museum, Gris is launching a critique, in effect saying that, let's see, I'll quote Chris here. Gris makes a plea for a return to easily recognizable subject matter. And I think Chris implies or suggests that Picasso actually listened. This, I think, is a major headline of the book, which gives Gris a place in the turning of Cubism away from the brink of abstraction and back to legibility. Almost done. This suggests that Gris was a conservative. But Chris also makes a strong case for Gris as an interrogative painter, one who's slipping and sliding planes, not yet. In subsequent works like the book of, there it is on the right, the book of 1913, these slipping and sliding planes, which I think might have something to do with coding and decoding machines that were being invented around World War I, that these get us not just to reflect, but to get involved in the reconstruction and the viewing of the painting. And it was your monograph on Gris in 1992 that got me involved with Gris in the first place. And I'm going to stop there because we want to have some time for some questions. Thank you.
And sit in the hot seats. So, that was a... Chris, sit in the middle. These are working. So that was a wonderful response, Harry, because it, I think you threw out a lot of interesting challenges about the structure of the book and, what's in it, what's not in it, and why, which I think was very, very helpful. As you rightly said, we're a bit tight for time, so I'm quite keen to make sure that the people here have a chance to ask questions, given that was all extremely rich, rather than us getting straight into a long conversation now. Can I just make sure there's nobody out there who wants to put their hand up? You've quelled them. I guess, you won't be surprised that I'm interested in the reality side of this, of the title of the book. And you said something about, I don't mean, a straightforward sense of these things are meant to depict, facts or real, reality, the experience of reality as we normally think of it or whatever. What kind of reality are you talking about when you talk about Cubism in its relationship to reality?
It's very, very varied.
Pick up your microphone, yes.
On the bar.
It's very different after collage from before collage, it seems to me. Before collage, I think they're basically absorbed in the same issue, really, that Cézanne was absorbed in, Impressionism was absorbed in, which is the gap between how you actually perceive the world and how much you can perceive the world. I could draw this chair, and I haven't really looked at it very much, but I know from sitting in it and my feelings about it and everything about it, I know what it's like. So there's a great deal given to us by perception before we can analyze a thing, or before we need to analyze a thing objectively. And I think Cézanne knew that. And I think there's the gap between the fullness of the perception that perception gives us in our kind of feeling and knowledge of the things around us, the gap between that and what painting can do. I mean, how far can painting, this art of making marks on a flat surface, actually bring back, to any degree, the intensity with which we actually experience the world all round. The touch of it, the smell of it, the visual impact of it. And these two people, I mean, Picasso, from very, very early in his life, was always going to be a painter. He, in a sense, his whole life was tuned towards visually responding to the world and having a kind of grasp of it, a real grasp of it, which he could somehow translate into the terms of making paintings, really, making drawings, making paintings. Braque, and I do think it's very important, you raised it yourself, but Braque, because he was not just, it wasn't just that his father was a painter. His father actually ran a pretty big business in Le Havre. He was actually in charge of the decoration of the Opera House of Le Havre. I mean, he was a big painter decorator. He had his son trained to be a painter decorator. Went through a 2-year training. He got the diploma you had to get as an artisan. And so he had worked very directly, and worked from childhood, really, because he worked with his father quite a lot, on kind of with the flatness of walls in front of him. Whereas Picasso was in drawing studios with the model over there, Braque was working with actual physical flat areas, which he was reinventing, in a sense, by his decorative techniques, by making false marble, making this and that and so on, friezes. And so he had a very different, direct, I think, sense of the world from Picasso. And that comes over, I think, in the work itself. But what I'm trying to get at is that before collage, there was this, they really were working with the gap between the fullness of our perception of things and what painting can do in any way to capture that. After collage, they're working with how you can use the amount of information that's given through all of the modern techniques that are suddenly they're very much aware of, printing, reproductions of any kind, how that can be, how the excitement of that and the sheer kind of complexity of it can somehow be brought into works of art. I think they're working with that. So that's, but also they're working with real pieces of material. And that's very important. And I tried to, when I was talking about how things are ephemeral, these collages are so ephemeral, I think it's so important that we can only see them when they're taken out of the drawers that they're in conservation studios. We can only see them probably for 3 months at a time. Otherwise, they're disappearing. And not only that, so we don't have the direct physical experience of them that Picasso himself had, that anybody who came into his studio and actually handled them and looked at them had. And the same with Braque. We can't have that object experience anymore.
Harry, you
I'm
want
going
say
to jump
something?
in
Yeah.
just to say on the reality question, I think one of the passages in the book that really has stuck with me, and I think the question really becomes urgent with Hermetic Cubism, those paintings like The Accordionist, we don't know what's going on really. Although Pepe's book has tried to figure that out to a large extent, but you suggest that it is something like the babble that precedes the learning or accompanies the learning of a language, and I thought that was very interesting.
It's yes.
Yeah, and then my other point in your talk, one of the highlights for me was when you juxtaposed the Merleau-Ponty passage to The Accordionist, and my thought was, I think that Merleau-Ponty passage is as hermetic as the painting. And what does it mean? And what does it mean to say that we can somehow back up before the perceptual system kicks in and feel something more basic?
I don't try and argue that that's what's happening at all, because I actually think these pictures can take you to they take you away from seeing an object as so clearly, solidly there in front of you. I'm talking about the Hermetic pictures, and they leave you in a state of uncertainty. You're recognizing things and then not recognizing them, and then you're getting into the space as if you're in a room, and then you're not. All of that. What was I going to say. Not quite sure.
It's very tough stuff, I think.
But isn't the
make-
point? Isn't the point this that, you know, if Merleau-Ponty's trying to talk about the possibility of, you know, a sort of primordial sense of perception, i.e., that we could become.
I'm not trying to argue.
No,
What
I
I'm
know
trying
you're
to
not.
say
But
is
but the
that what I'm
point
trying to
is,
say is that we oscillate between not seeing what's in there, but somehow plunging into it, and reflecting on what might be there,
yes,
and reflecting on how it is that we're seeing something in there, and yet not. So there's this oscillation between plunging into the work and reflecting on it.
but for these for a
And so it's very
thinker
conscious
like
and
for a
it's not-
thinker like Merleau-Ponty, it's actually, you know, Cézanne or somebody who is most capable, or that kind of art is the most capable of suggesting the possibility of what it would be like to perceive the world.
Like that.
Out, you know, on the threshold of language, if you like, you know. So it's to do with this problem of, okay, you said we're all very aware of how we perceive. Well, the whole point of that argument is
No,
we're not,
how
right?
we perceive. No, not how we perceive. Just we know a great deal more from just simply how we experience the world than we could add that we could.
But
put
we're
in
not.
some sort of
But we're not
analytical
necessarily
framework.
self-aware of doing that. Anyway, I'm having an argument with you now. Sorry about that.
That's perfectly all right. That's
Yeah,
what
yeah.
we're supposed to do.
Yeah. We could get worked up here. I just want to check that. Yes,
I
Michael.
think there must be questions out there.
Thank you, Chris. I think I follow your argument as long as the collage elements are real newspaper or whatever. But when it gets into faux chair caning, that seems to me to be moving toward Marcel Duchamp, Touma, and the kind of play between illusion and reality that makes painting seem
I agree. And
impossible.
a lot of what I try and say in that chapter is actually about the fake and about the fact that so much of it is actually about faking and about then the question of, is this chair caning? Is it not chair caning? If it's not, all of those questions then come up because what we're looking at is a fake all the time.
But is it still moving toward reality at that point, or is it moving away from it
think
into illusion?
it can move towards it, it seems to me.
So is it illusion or reality? Which?
I'm not quite hearing, that's the trouble.
Oh, well, it just seems like if there is so much illusion in the picture, the possibility of getting to reality through the painting is compromised. It's
Yeah, you
illusion
can't.
that's
I mean,
interfering.
And I think, yes, you don't get to it. I think that's all I would say. You don't get to it. You keep on trying to, but you don't. And certainly in the Hermetic pictures, it's like that. And it's like that, I think, in the collages too.
I think one of my takeaways is that, you know, you have a basic argument, and I appreciate that, which is a project of rescue of figurative painting, but that the corollary to that is it had to be rescued from the brink of something else, which they were very, very drawn to as well.
I think that's right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Few. Other questions?
One more. Andrew.
So, hi, thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting, all three of you. Asked by someone who is not a Cubist scholar at all, I'm incredibly drawn to that photograph that you showed us of that tableau of the guitar player and the cafe stand and so on and so forth. So that seems to me to be yet another approach to reality that combines elements that we haven't been talking about so far, which is, you know, actual space, actual objects, and not flat objects, and so on. How does this fit in with the larger project, let's say?
With the what project?
With the larger project that, how does this feels
Picasso
incredibly playful to me, but I don't know whether I'm identifying that correctly.
Well, I tried to get over how I think it's in some ways it's a joke, and in some ways it's dead serious, and it's both. it seems to me. And I mean, I think, and I'm in the Hermetic, when I'm talking about the Hermetic Cubist work with Picasso, I make a point about the tassel that he paints in a particular picture, which connects with a tassel in the Henri Rousseau portrait that he owned. And I see it as a way in which he's confronting Rousseau as a painter who wanted to paint the solidity of things and how things were weighed, how could weigh a weight and you could pull them and pull the cord and so on and so forth. And he wanted to set that against what he was doing, which was in sense exploring how painting could do that at all, and doubting to some extent whether it could with any real persuasiveness. And I think those pictures, as I say, he's exploring what painting can do when you deprive painting from making things instantly recognizable, what it can still do, the making of marks, to make reality, the reality you're trying to represent, seem to be appearing or beginning to appear. Do you see what I mean? It's how he was exploring how painting, when it's deprived of direct recognizable representation, can still work representationally. I think.
I mean, one thing I get from this amazing this thing, is that what we're sort of talking about? Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you can still see everything in it, actually. You can still see the construction upper right. You can still see most of the things that really, you can't see what was on the left-hand side. But I thought it showed, although it's coming apart, it still shows enough, I think. Do you get at what is there?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think that looking at that, the guitar is just so boring. You know, it's just like the most basic stripped down sort of nothing guitar, and it seems in some way to be, I don't know, I just think that the Picasso elements are thrown into relief as so much more real in a way. You know,
well,
it's
the guitar gets sort of transfigured by them in a way, right? The ordinariness of the guitar.
Maybe it's just so ordinary and basic and sort of, it's like a pre-guitar. I don't know what it is. Yeah.
It's the one you first hand, Harry.
Yeah.
Anyway, look, we've overstayed our welcome a little bit. There's one more thing I need to say to you, which is that if you're excited and intrigued by this book and the chapter outline given by Harry, it is for sale outside, and this person here will sign it for you should you wish to buy one. Anyway, please thank Gris and the respondent.